More protests happening at George Washington University. We saw even the small attempts to blockade this were being taken over.
That's right. And similar to what Harvard did, where they restricted their yard to students only, George Washington University, which is in D.C., was trying to limit the outside agitators, the professional protesters, professional organizers, as we've been seeing around the country, and trying to at least limit it to students. But there was an encampment between the University Yard and H Street, where at 11:28 p.m. last night, protesters toppled the police barricades that were set up. So these weren't just university barricades. These were police barricades. They were toppled. It looks like a bizarro world Les Miserables, where they're standing on top of the barricades, waving a Palestinian flag with a bullhorn, shouting their hateful rhetoric. And the police tried to then arrest some of these people that toppled these barricades, and the protesters pushed back so much so that it seems like the police officers were maybe in fear of their safety. According to the report from the student paper, the organizers said the demonstrators were able to de-arrest the detained protesters as chants from the crowd against the police continued. So a very tumultuous situation, and we're seeing that spread across the country.
You see colleges shutting down essentially commencement exercises, classes from the East Coast to the West Coast. And there is minimal pushback, I would argue, from university administrators. In part, I think they are afraid of the students. And so part of the issue, I think, long run, is many students have been raised, I would argue, without parents. And that's not something that we can address in the short run. And secondarily, I would argue, consistent with comments I've made earlier, that the more privileged the students are, the more elite the campus is, the more unlikely that the administrators are prepared to act. And if indeed they are prepared to act, then the question becomes, are the political leaders in certain areas, let's say Washington, D.C., prepared to allow the police to do their job? And generally speaking, I would say they're unwilling to allow the police to do their job. This is political and some might say moral insanity. But lastly, Thomas Sowell has said that in politics, we should never assume that because something is insane, it will not be done. And I think that is unfolding in the United States. So the students are saying death to Israel, death to the United States. But before death to the United States occurs, please pay off our student loans. Right. This is absurd.
Right. And I think that's even a good point, because there's a lot of people even out there saying, well, the faculty is not only just scared of press and media reaction, they're also scared of parents. So you said there's a lack of parenting, but there's also going to be parents who are going, how dare you do this to my student who is just setting up a tent on campus and protesting and chanting death to America. We're withdrawing our funds. We're going to take our donations somewhere else. Will, it is kind of living in the upside down world.
And there was this article from the New York Times over the weekend that the headline is "Denied a Second Chance at a Normal Senior Year." And it was drawing comparisons about how this class that's preparing to graduate here at universities across the country were also seniors in high school when, at the beginning of the pandemic, when pretty much across the country during that first May, schools were shut down. So the following one, yes, many in California may have not had normal graduations, but at this point, this first May of 2020, many schools didn't have traditional commencement ceremonies, at least in the way that many want of the pomp and circumstance. But they were trying to draw this comparison between the pandemic shutting down schools and now on these college campuses, many aren't able to do that because of these protests. But it just caught me as odd that there was no call directly on university boards, faculty, administration to say, we can stop this. We can stop this quickly. We can call the police in. We can disband the encampments and set up security measures. But there doesn't seem to be the will of these university administrations to give this normal senior year commencement to many of these college campuses.
and I think their will and willingness to take action has been drained by the feckless belief that taking action is seen as right-wing speech. So in other words, shutting down unrest that prevents speech, that prevents a university from operating, that prevents a university from educating students, that is seen as a right-wing move. And I think many of the administrators and many of the faculty, they are unwilling to take action. So they're unwilling to make the hard choices. And I also would argue that their unwillingness actually breeds more unrest. So it just multiplies.
It all comes back around. If you go far enough to the left, eventually it becomes fascism as well. You'll be the far left that's preaching tolerance, preaching, canceling people for having a different point of view than you. But when that point of view is actually for a government, a terrorist organization that is filled with hate, that is filled with hate of people of all kinds, whether that is your faith, whether that is your gender. If you're just a woman, obviously it's a very different world. And of course, if you are anything that could be considered Western. But the horseshoe comes back around. It comes together at the same point, which is the far left eventually takes you to that point. And you see that in all walks of life now. But now it's gotten to the extreme where they're defending terrorism. No one is calling for the fact there can't be protests. We all think that there should be allowed to have peaceful protests. However, that's not what's happening here. You are having a little bit more violent protests. You are having people calling for the death to America. You also have this happening in private property. This is not always happening on a public, even university. Some of them are. You could go to a University of California or one of those. But when you're talking about Columbia, sure there's some federal funding or state funding coming from. But this is not fair game.
The rhetoric is so heightened and genocidal in many ways that if the universities, they have a duty to protect their students and their constituencies. If the protesters were not saying anything in support of terror, I feel like you would have a much
different... If it was just a humanitarian thing, saying you don't like the images that are coming out of Gaza, I understand that. I don't like them either. I don't like looking at them.
But it's not that. We're talking about open support for a designated terrorist organization that is sanctioned, we've tried to isolate, a war is being fought against because of terror, that the safety of their students, they're having to shut down their campuses and cancel their graduations. It's not just that this is an inconvenience. There is an actual fear that people will get hurt even more than they already have.
We decided today that we're going to take even more action. Our legal team right now is preparing demand letters to all of the institutions that these encampments are happening at. And also we're going to provide it to you. So if you have a student who's in it, or you're one of those students, you can have what your rights are as well, because we believe they have a legal obligation to protect not just Jewish students, but pro-Zionist students, which is essentially evangelical Christians. And we have to stop violent protests on these campuses. We can't do that without you and your support at the ACLJ.